Welcome everyone to this, our new 2024 first lecture in our Zoom series, the 170th of the Zoom series that we have had so far, 178 of the Zoom series we've had so far. Our speaker today is Raymond Leury. He is our resident expert on electric vehicles and has become, in his retirement after a long career in IT, he has become the president of the Electrical Vehicle Council of Ottawa. And with all of the work that he's done in research and so on, and all the things that he has done, he has become our expert to go to. And he was spearheading the transition for OC Transpo to go to electric buses. So this is wonderful on some of the work that he's doing. Today, he's going to be talking not specifically about EVs, but more about the greenhouse gas trends that we see and organizing for climate change, and bringing us up to date as to whether or not we have reason to hope or to look that we might actually have a future where we are not going to cause societal collapse and problems for everybody else. So Raymond, I would like you to go ahead. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jean, and thanks to KCOR for again having the privilege of presenting to you. It really is an honor to present to this group. Before we get into the presentation, what I want to say is that this what you're going to hear today summarizes what I know about the climate situation and the solutions to the climate. Particularly to reduce greenhouse gases. So it's based on literally years of reading and thinking about the subject, and you'll see some books at the end that I'll show that have much of the content that we'll be presenting today. So I hope to bring you on a journey where you'll see that we can and we also need to take rapid action in response to climate change. Okay, so a bit about my background. Don't want to talk about this too much, but I just want to explain why would you want to hear from me, and why am I presenting on this stuff? So I've got a background that has a fairly unique mix of science and business training. And when I say business here, what I mean is not necessarily counting numbers, counting dollars. What I mean is, how do you get a business to do something that you want it to do? Okay, so how do you get people in an organization that are facing change, that are scared of change? How do you get them to figure out that the change is good for them, and from there get them to participate in accelerating this change, right? So this is very similar to the climate issue in my opinion, and I see lots of parallels. I could give examples where where this applies, but I will spare you. So one of the things that's been the people have been saying lately, they've been talking about what their superpower is, right? So if I have a superpower, my superpower is that I've always been able to take a huge amount of data and distill it into something that makes some sense. And what I've been doing in trying to sell projects is trying to articulate what the value of the project is in a way that people understand, right? So that's where I'm coming from. Change is scary. What we used to say, so I was a consultant for the last 14 years of my career. And aside from it depends, what we used to say is that what's hard will have to be done by tomorrow. But what's impossible will take a bit longer. So we often were told that things are impossible, but reality is if you work at things, there's a lot of things that are possible that you wouldn't expect to be possible. So anyways, in that context, I've been talking about and reading about climate change for a number of years. So here I say never say never. The reason I bring this up here is that I often hear in some of our discussions, and especially in the email groups, I hear often things like must, will, always, never. And what I want to point out is those are fairly extreme positions. So if you say something will never happen, never is a long time. So I've said before that some things would never happen, and they turned out to happen when there was enough time that elapsed, right? So But the point there is that if you take an extreme position, and it's really, in a sense, an extreme position, there's always a possibility that that you're wrong, and maybe you should reassess once in a while. So the laws of nature are fixed. Most of you have worked in the natural sciences where you're looking at issues that are related to the laws of nature. Could take all sorts of examples, but if we look at gravity, for example, well, we could say that gravity is never going to change, and we could say exactly how to measure it and all that, right? So we know that that is a fixed thing, that won't change over time. But technology changes over time. So something that may be true or false at a certain point in time may become the opposite in the future. So technology in particular, the answers will often change. I'll give you a quick example here. So if you would have asked someone in 1990, is it possible to get all the processing power required for a smartphone into a portable device? People would have told you, no, that's absolutely impossible to do. But now, today in 2023, we know, and actually we've been doing this for a while, that it is possible to do that. So the point here is that something that was impossible and false before became true. Okay, and there's a lot of things that we're going to look at that are related to technologies that address climate change, where the answer is changed over time. So 30 or 40 years ago, some of these things were not possible, but today they are because the technology has evolved. By the way, we're going to talk about forecasting a bit later, but just a point that Moore's law, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, would have predicted quite well that this answer would change over time. Okay, so when we're looking at what we want to do in forecasts of technology, we want to really try to figure out what things are going to look like in 10, 20, 30, 50 years, right? So if you have an extreme position, again, you should, once in a while, you should check whether it's still correct, because often the answers will change, particularly when we're talking about technology. Now, I'm showing this chart here. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this. This I found truly astonishing and actually frightening. The 2023 starting the middle of the year is really an outlier in terms of temperatures. And yes, El Nino has an impact here, but we had El Ninos way back in the 40s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, but the temperature never got that hot. So we know that the fact that it's that hot is clearly changed by clearly caused by climate change. And this reinforces the need to do something, right? One of the things I want to point out is that whatever the goal is for the amount of warming that would be quote unquote acceptable, there isn't really a number, right? We talk about 1.5 and 2, whatever. Things don't drastically change from 1.5 to 1.6. They incrementally get worse, right? So in that context, getting to 2 instead of 4 is better, right? So, and getting to 4 instead of 6 is better. I'm not saying that 4 is good, right? 4 would mean some really catastrophic issues that would happen. All sorts of things that would change on the planet because of that, and we probably have mass famines, etc. So, I'm not saying that this is not an issue. What I'm saying is, when we look at this, we want to have the least amount of warming possible. Okay. So let's talk about the fossil fuel industry and their narrative. Okay. First of all, this climate change thing, given that the solution is generally believed to be that we need to stop burning fossil fuels, well, this is an existential crisis for the fossil fuel industry. Okay, so they're going to do everything they can to try to slow this down, right? So they hire the best PR firms in the world, and these happen to be literally the same PR firms that told us in the 50s and 60s that cigarettes didn't cause cancer. They're using the same types of techniques, same types of arguments to show that, or to supposedly prove that these are not issues, right? These people, they'll fight dirty, as I say here, and they'll go to great lengths to mold the public opinion. It's all about changing the public opinion, okay, and getting people to accept that we need to keep on burning fossil fuels because, well, we make profit selling fossil fuels, so we don't want that to stop, okay? One of the things that I learned from my the management background this is not necessarily very obvious, but the only purpose of marketing, and when you talk about marketing, there's advertising, there's PR, there's a bunch of other things related to that. It's not just pure what people normally say as marketing. The only purpose for it is to change your opinion. Okay, it might be to get you to eat a certain cereal brand instead of another, which is relatively innocuous, but it might be to tell you that if the federal government's clean energy or green energy electricity plan will quadruple the price of your electricity, right? So the point is, any marketing activity is really to change your opinion, and there's lots of stuff that's going on to change your opinion in all sorts of ways. And the lesson here is you should never assume. So this is a strong word, but I would say never assume that you're being told the truth. So you're not always told a lie, but sometimes you're being told a lie. Okay, why are you being told a lie? Because people have interest in continuing what they're doing, selling more of what they're selling, or whatever it is. If you look at the example on the left-hand side there, it says Ontario's first carbon negative bus. You know anything about climate change and carbon and all that, you'll know that this is absolutely impossible. The claim that they're making is that this bus is using renewable natural gas, so that the net there is zero. So they might have a claim to say that it's a net zero bus, but saying that it's negative is impossible. This bus would have to suck up carbon and sequester that carbon in some way, shape, or form to be negative. Okay, so in this case, we're seeing a case where they're outright lying to us, and this is a campaign that's driven by Enbridge. Okay, Enbridge, they sell fossil gas, so they have an interest in people believing that this is true, right? So this also applies to statements of the fossil fuel industry, like saying that we'll always need fossil fuels. Okay, we'll talk a bit about that as we go through. So a bit more about the narrative. So the goalposts are changing when they're when the fossil fuel industry is trying to slow down progress, right? So they started off by saying years ago, and I remember seeing that years ago, that we can't run an electrical grid with more than about 5 or 10% of renewables. Okay, well, once we got over that, what they said, well, what I really meant was, well, we can't do more than 25, or maybe now it's 50, maybe now it's 100%. We can't do 100% renewables. Okay. Well, lo and behold, BC and Quebec, they're doing it with hydro. So they're essentially 100% renewables. There's some far away, not grid connected communities that are using diesel, but it's the exception. Australia is actually doing renewables with wind and solar. So there's areas of Australia where they're essentially 100% wind. There's other examples of other places in the world where that is happening. So they changed the narrative again, right? So now they talk about Dunkelflaut, and I will let you the pleasure of looking at what that means, and won't talk about it anymore. But so other things that they're saying. So the transition to clean energy requires more stuff than the status quo. Now this might have been true 30 or 40 years ago, when the technology was less mature, and we didn't have the optimized production processes for things like windmills and solar panels, but it's not true today. However, the fossil fuel industry wants you to believe that. Okay, we can't transition fast enough, so we need to use fossil gas as a bridge. This has been used to justify converting coal plants to natural gas. Well, this is a really questionable thing. Fossil gas is not really a bridge because it does emit a lot of GHGs, and actually, if you actually do the right calculations, include leakage of methane, a gas-fired electrical plant actually emits more or just about as much GHGs as a coal plant. Okay, um, we'll we'll pass on that. But anyways, so the fossil fuel industry, as I was saying, the writing is on the wall for them, right? And they're fighting very hard to keep their markets. They're doing everything they can to slow down the transition. Here, I'll be a bit controversial, but what I'll tell you is some of you have internalized these points, and you're largely unwittingly helping the fossil fuel industry getting their points across. Okay, and again, this is not necessarily nefarious on your part. It's that the narrative has been so strong, and some of these things were true. like the transition to clean energy require more stuff. That was true at some point, but it's not true anymore. The fossil fuel industry has encouraged you to believe it's still true, and they're trying to get people to repeat that. So they have lots of money. They're using everything that they have available, including AI and including social media and all that, to influence as many people as possible, because they're trying to keep their business afloat, right? So another thing that might be a bit controversial is that I'm willing to bet, and my betting limit is $5. So, but I'm willing to bet $5 that they've infiltrated some of the groups that you're part of, not necessarily directly. But they certainly have put some ideas in some of the groups you're part of in their heads that are incorrect. So I've encountered this very often when I talk about EVs to environmental groups, where they think that for some reason, cobalt and child labor is an issue with EVs, but it's not an issue with the cobalt that's in your laptop or in your smartphone or that's used by the oil industry to desulfurize crude oil. Okay, so you see the traces of an influence campaign, because it's being portrayed as being specifically an EV thing. It's not an EV thing. It's a general cobalt thing, and actually I would say it's a general supply chain issue. So in every supply chain, we should not have what's purported to be child labor in the Congo mining cobalt, right? So they take a small grain of truth and they take it completely out of context, okay? So what can we conclude at this point? So greenwashing is real, okay? And I gave you an example there with a bus, and it's very well funded, okay? Because people are trying to sell what they have to sell, right? So if they could make it look like it's better for the environment, they will try that. But that doesn't mean that everything is greenwashing. There's a lot of things out there that are not greenwashing. Okay, and we need to call out the greenwashing. We need to understand what's what. So we really need to understand what is greenwashing and what is not. And this is not always obvious. Okay, so this is one thing that I think we've debated somewhat in our groups, and it's a healthy debate to have, because it's a complex issue and it's not always obvious. And I'll talk about it in the context of carbon capture and utilization and storage, which you might have heard about. So first point here is that it works. Okay, so if you're telling people that CCS or CCUS doesn't work, that is technically incorrect. Okay, so, and I've learned this a hard way in the EV world, where you have to be careful how you communicate things. But the reality of it is, there are solutions that will capture carbon. There are solutions that will allow you to use that carbon. There are solutions that will allow you to sequester that carbon. Question you have to ask is this a good solution though? And this is where we're having problems. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, hate to use that word, but to capture all this CO2. It requires lots of energy, and the higher percentage you capture of the CO2, the more energy it requires. Okay, so so what do you do then when you've got the CO2 captured? So it's nice to have it captured, but then what do you do with it, right? So there is only a very small market for CO2 at this point. That may change over time, possible, but right now there isn't a very big market, and there's lots of CO2 to capture. What does that mean for the price? It means the price will be low or negative. Negative means you have to pay people to take the CO2 from you. Okay, excuse me. So the other issue is is the issue of leakage. What you would like to have is a situation where things will never leak. So there's a lot of CCS solutions right now that store carbon in reservoirs where it's really not clear that it won't leak at some point. So it's not a permanent solution. So there's a lot of reasons to doubt the quality of the solutions and the effectiveness of the solutions that are out there. It's also very difficult to see how this could be economically viable. If you have to pay people to take the carbon, that's a heck of a problem to overcome. Now, if you have subsidies, you have a carbon price, there are ways actually to make this economically viable. However, if you have to depend on subsidies and carbon pricing, you could get a change of government that will change that and make the model not viable anymore, right? So, so it's better if you could have solutions that stand on their own and will be adopted just by the economics of it, right? So CCUS, it doesn't make sense, except there are a few niche situations. I won't go into that where it does make sense. It's currently not a viable solution, right? And this is a significant problem in this case, because if you look at the pathways that have been developed to get to net zero by 2050, all of them depend on some level of sequestering of carbon. So if we could get CCUS to work, that would be fantastic. Okay, that would be very, very helpful. Now, here I want to illustrate what the background I have and how that's important. So here, you look at the technology part, and it works, right? The technology works, but if you look at the business part of it, it doesn't work anymore because the economic incentives aren't there. Okay. Last point here is that we need more research in this space. We need lots more research, because this is something that we need to find a way, some shape or form, to sequester carbon. Okay. So what are the choices that we have? So here I'm going to go through three options, and you may say that they're a bit extreme, but I will I've designed them in a way to illustrate the point, right? So if we go to option one is to accept that climate change is happening and it can't be stopped, and to do nothing. So essentially, this is the business as usual scenario. Okay. So what are the consequences of that? That means we're still continuing to burn massive amounts of fossil fuels, increasing greenhouse gases, releasing methane, etc. So we would get warming, somewhere north of 6 degrees Celsius, probably by the end of this century, type of thing, right? So, won't argue the exact numbers here, but there'll be lots of warming, and there'll be lots of consequences, which are likely to be large famines, migrations. So people will lose the ability to grow food. They'll migrate to where there's food. Likely to be bloodshed. If people don't have food to feed their families, they tend to get violent. So because they care about their family and they want a good future for their families, so they're gonna fight very hard to get that. And the last point there is that if that was to be the case, we've had discussions before about what's the carrying capacity of the earth and all that. Bottom line, though, is that if we keep on doing what we're doing now, at some point we're going to have massive issues and massive famine and massive depopulation, perhaps even the extinction of the human race, right, or human species. But the consequences are quite dire. When I say that we could support 1 billion here, this is a number. It's based on the population of the world in the year 1800. Which was about 1 billion, and at that point, I think we could agree that human activity was not big enough to it was sustainable, right? Because we didn't have that many people on the earth at that point. But if we look at those 7 billion people that would not be supportable by in this scenario, it's the poorest of the poor. It's the ones who did the least to contribute to the problem. So ethically, this is not fair that they would pay the price for the bad that we've done. So if you look at our situation here in North America in particular, no matter what the outcomes are, we are likely to be some of the ones that will end up on top and have the best outcomes. Okay, and we could discuss that at length, but the reality is, because of our wealth and because of what the technology we have and all that, we are the ones who have the highest chance of survival here if things really go wrong, right? So the fossil fuel industry wants some version of this, okay? And to me, this is not an acceptable situation, because it's ethically speaking, I don't think we we want to sacrifice 7 billion people. So option two, it's a bit of an other extreme option. So here we go back to some past state where we live within the limits of the planet. Okay, so we've talked about degrowth. This would be something that would look like a pre-1800 civilization where we don't have that much of a carbon footprint, right? That would imply, though, that we are foregoing technology, and for a number of reasons. One of them is to avoid overshoot. The other one is that much of our technology relies on fossil fuels at this point in time anyways. In particular, we use fossil fuels to produce artificial fertilizers, and if we do not produce those artificial fertilizers, a good portion of our population is not going to be able to survive. So low impact existence, what are the consequences? Well, there'll be less warming than option one, but if we do nothing to slow down warming, current trends are that right now we have baked into what's already been emitted in the atmosphere about 4 degrees of warming by the end of this century. So again, this would have all sorts of dire consequences for the climate and for the weather. So we would expect massive famines, etc. If we don't have the fertilizers we need to feed everybody, well, people are gonna die of starvation, right? So again, this in this scenario, we would essentially sacrifice a large portion of the population. Now, I say 7 billion here. It doesn't really matter what the exact number is. The bottom line is a large portion of the population, right? So again, who are those people? Well, it's the poor. It's the ones who didn't do anything, right? The other thing about this option is that this, in some ways, is a bit of a utopic option, and I personally, if this would work, I wouldn't be unhappy with it. The problem is we can't get people to choose this willingly, because it implies that there's too many people on the island, and we have to vote some people out of the island, right, off the island. So, so the result really is war, revolution, bloodshed, things of that nature to get the population down to 1 billion. Okay. This is not acceptable to me, because I don't think we want to sacrifice that many people. So if you go to option three, we use the technology we have to decarbonize and eliminate GHGs and do more things. I mean, this is a bit of an oversimplification. Electrifying everything is a part of it. It's not the whole solution. There's other things beyond electrifying that we need to do to eliminate GHGs, and certainly things we need to do to remove GHGs from the atmosphere. So what are the consequences? Well, less warming than option 1 or 2. Eventually, some reversible warming. That will take a long time, but there's potential of reversing some of the warming. There'll be less famines. I'm not saying there wouldn't be, because again, if we go to 2 degrees Celsius of warming, that's likely to cause some serious problems and could result in lots of famines throughout the world. So, so this is not by any means a rosy scenario where everything is hunky-dory and everybody, everybody gets to participate in the party type of thing. So, so there would be, you could expect that there might be some people who won't be able to survive because they won't be able to feed themselves, etc. But it would be less. How much less? Not sure, but less than the other 2 scenarios. The risk here is that we don't have or won't have the technology. Now, the IEA, and we'll talk about the IEA a bit later, they're estimating that we have 65% of the technology required to decarbonize by 2050, and that the other 35% we have pathways to get there. Okay, so this option, what's interesting about it is humans will choose to do this willingly. Okay, we're not asking people to vote themselves off the island here. We're asking people to help move in a different direction where we use a lot less fossil fuels and release a lot less greenhouse gases. So to me, this is really the only acceptable solution. Okay. Now you could argue that there's various in between options here. Absolutely, there are, but the basic 3 choices are there, right? And any other option here, the reason I say it's the only acceptable solution is any other option means that a bunch of people will die. So option 3, what do we want to do in terms of implementing it? Well, we want to avoid revolutions and bloodshed because we want to avoid mass casualty events, right? What does that mean? That means that we have to assume the capitalist system will be there. So I know there's some people that are talking about, what if we had a different system, Marxism, communism, whatever, and we use that to do changes in a more directive top-down way and all that. And maybe there's a way of doing that faster and all that, possibly. But to get there, to move away from a capitalist system, we would need to have some revolutions, essentially. Okay. The features, and one of the features of the capitalist system is that there's strong monetary incentives, and this will become important as we go through the presentation. Okay, so one of the biggest features is people are strongly incented to make money. Okay, to feed themselves, to buy what they want to buy, whatever, right? Note here, this is so China is arguably the most capitalist country on the planet. Okay, if we'll won't dive into that too much, but if you look at what China is doing, it's one of the places in the world where there's the least rules and regulations that restrain what a private enterprise could do. So from that perspective, it's a very much a capitalist country. It is a communist government, though, authoritarian government. And so the point here is democratic or authoritarian governments will work and will allow us to implement option 3. Okay. In some cases, actually, authoritarian governments, not that I want those, absolutely not. But if you look at China, China's been able to do some stuff that others haven't been able to do because essentially, if the boss says so, you do it, and there's no questioning it, right? So with a democracy, everybody has their way, their word, and a lot of people have veto rights, right? So I think the challenge here is to figure out how to use capitalism to drive the right changes and to decarbonize our society. Okay. So a bit of background here. I'm going to try to speed it up because I'm going to run out of time here. So how big is the problem? So I want to illustrate a few things here. This is from the energy consumption. Here we're talking energy because energy is the biggest source of greenhouse gases, right? So if you look on the right-hand side, those are the sources of energy used in the U.S. And by the way, solar is 1.5 quads, which is about 1.5% of production in U.S. in 2021. Just note that India is already at 5%. So solar is providing 5% of the power in India. Okay, so some of this stuff applies to and will be adopted by less wealthy countries for economic reasons, as we'll see later. But the point here is that on the left-hand side, we want to eliminate natural gas, coal, and petroleum because those are the ones that generate all the GHGs. If you look on the right-hand side of the diagram, there's two things there. There's energy services. That's the real work that you get out of all this energy that's on the left-hand side. And if you look at the number there, 31.8, it's much smaller than the 97 quads total, right? So the box on top, the rejected energy, is twice as big. And this is the number for the US, right? It's twice as big. And that reflects the fact that the sources of energy we have, particularly petroleum, are very inefficient. If you look at the transportation box, the last one at the bottom there in pink, you'll see that if you do the math, 21% efficiency is what we get in the US with petroleum products. Okay, not very high. So the point here is that there are ways where we could reduce that rejected energy, and that we do not need to replace all the rejected energy. So when people are talking about what do we need to do to decarbonize, we don't need to replace all of the fossil fuels, one per one in terms of how much energy they contain. What we need to replace is that the energy services, the net energy that we are actually able to use from these things. Now, if you look at some technologies, and I'll talk about heat pumps here. So air source heat pumps, they are somewhere around 300, 400% efficient. Okay, so if you look at it from the context of this diagram there, it means that if you put one unit of energy on the left-hand side, what you come out of on the other side is 300 or 400. Sorry, 3 or 4, not 100. Okay, so you get 3 or 4 more. So that means that we're getting a lot of energy services from very little energy, right? Other examples, and this applies to just about everything that's electric instead of being fossil fuel based. EVs, they're about 75 to 85% efficient. There's different ways of accounting for it, but let's say we say 75%. Well, you saw the transportation is 21% in the US, and EVs are then 3 to 4 times more efficient. So that means that in an EV world, that rejected energy box is much smaller. Okay, so again, the point here is we don't need to replace all the energy we're using. We need to replace the useful energy that we have. Okay, so the problem is not as big as many people think. So let's move on to forecasting technology adoption. And the International Energy Agency is going to come out here in a number of situations. So you probably heard me say, this is one of my favorite quotes. Wayne Gretzky says, I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been. Okay, so where is the puck right now? Well, we're in a fossil fuel based society. Most of our energy comes from fossil fuels, and if you want to get good historical data about this, the IEA is a great source. They've got fantastic amounts of great information about that. You could spend days having fun playing in that information and getting lots of good value. So at least from my point of view, because I'm interested in the topic, right? But the question really is, where are we going to be? Where are we going to be in 10, 20, 30 years? That is more important, because what we are doing today should be based on where we expect things to be sometime in the future. This is much tougher to do, and the IEA is particularly not good at this, and we'll see examples in the following slides. There's vested interests that want to drive this narrative. Okay, so if you look at the IEA, the reason they understate the pace of change, excuse me, is because the oil industry is influencing them and trying to convince them and try to orient the discussion towards slower growth and slower change. So if we look at the way technology gets adopted, it gets adopted following an S-curve. And I won't go into too much detail about that, but if you look on the left, the red line is an S-curve, an adoption curve. And this is based on the forecast we've been doing at EVCO. The line you see, the highlight box at the top that you see is the it shows in red up to 2017. Those are actual numbers that we use to develop the model to forecast. And the blue is the actual. So we haven't changed the forecast since 2017, and the blue is the actual. And I know that for 2023, we're going to be a bit above the red dot that's there. So we're going to be underestimating a bit. So our model seems to model reality. It seems to predict the future quite well. Okay, and this is normal because F-curves are the way that technology has been adopted from time immemorial. There's no reason to believe it would be any different here with the technologies that we're looking at, EVs here in particular. Okay, if we look at the diagram on the right, it's a combination of IEA data and also the Rocky Mountain Institute data, which I believe is much better. But again, if you look at the curve for the US, that's not an S-curve. Okay, world is not an S-curve. The China one is an S-curve, so that one is more believable than the other two. But so here, this is what the Rocky Mountain Institute is looking at as the low and high end estimates of what they expect for 2030. So one thing to look at here is that I think I missed one thing. Anyways, they're forecasting that we'll have somewhere around, say, 70% of our of the fleet of new sales will be EVs by 2030. Okay, and I think I missed it, but earlier on, no, it's right here. Okay, so if you look at the graph on the left, the lines you see where it says EV Outlook 2023, 2022, 2021, those are the different forecasts that the IEA has had over time. So what they've been doing is they're adjusting their forecast as reality shows them that their forecasts are out of date. Okay. In here, Rocky Mountain Institute, and again, the diagram is on the right here, they're showing that by 2030, we'll be somewhere around 70% market share, but the IEA is still forecasting in 2023, 35% market share. Okay, so the point here is the IEA underestimates the pace of change, and that unfortunately leads to I think bad policy, because as I put there, governments are setting policy based on what I believe are wildly inaccurate forecasts. Okay, and you can see that they're inaccurate. So I might, yeah, I'll skip that slide for now. So if we look at more IEA data, and we look at solar forecasts. So you look on the right. Again, those are the forecasts. Every year they increase their forecasts as reality shows them that their forecasts were wrong. Okay, so they're still underestimating the pace of change. And Global Witness actually said at some point that they're overly optimistic and therefore misleading about the potential future oil production. Okay. So, so the forecasts are because they're wrong, it's misleading people. Wind is similar. Won't belabor that, but so essentially, wind, solar, batteries, EVs, all of those, the IEA is underestimating the pace of change and pace of adoption. So, question here is, where will the puck be? Where will the puck be in 10, 20, 30 years? Okay, if we look at the numbers we're seeing there, that's from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So it's a reasonable estimate, but what you can see here is that we're expecting from last year to 2030, we're expecting the prices of solar to drop by about half still. So they're already very competitive. They're going to drop by half. And same with wind, not quite half, but I think it's about 30% or 40%. And same applies to batteries and EVs. So what does that mean? The costs are going to get lower. We know they're going to get lower. We had some people forecast these changes 10, 15 years ago, and their forecasts were pretty accurate. So we know these forecasts are good. And so it applies to batteries, applies to EVs, right? So essentially, one of the things I'm saying here is that because of this rapid reduction in cost, economics alone, forget government policy or anything, economics alone is going to drive adoption of a lot of these things. If you look at this graph here, it's our world in data. This is all historical data. Okay, so it's levelized cost of energy by technology. So levelized cost of energy essentially is a calculation of the total cost, so initial capital cost plus operating cost, maintenance, and all that for a facility that's producing energy. So it's the energy produced, number of kilowatt hours divided by the cost. No, sorry, the cost divided by the number of kilowatt produced. That gives you the cost of them, right? So you see here the numbers, and you see that there's many all the green technologies have been dropping in price substantially over time. Even concentrated solar power, which actually was ridiculed at some point as being uneconomical and unfeasible, it's now becoming competitive with fossil fuels. And that's important in that particular case because concentrated solar power gives us very high temperatures, and we need that for some industrial processes. So if you want to decarbonize those, concentrated solar power may be the solution. The point again here is that the costs have gone down, and the costs are predicted to keep on going down. Hydropower is an exception there, and actually I'll park that discussion for now, but hydropower is a different ballgame. But everything else, the costs are dropping, and we are expecting them. So they have dropped, and we're expecting them to continue to drop. So if you're looking at what's the cheapest source of energy, it's becoming more and more clear that it's wind and solar are the thing to do. So here, this graph, sorry if it's a bit fuzzy there. So it's Bloomberg NEF. Again, I want to show the forecast and how the forecasts are too conservative. So what they're saying here is that there's a 64% growth in solar was expected for 2023, and you see that in the number they have there. But you look at the history and you see that you're starting to see an S curve there. You're starting to see rapid adoption, but all of a sudden in 2024, that adoption slows. Like that doesn't make sense, right? So we know that the adoption will be higher than that. And if you look at the IEA, which is conservative again, they're estimating that to electrify everything, we need to have 4 or more times that amount of capacity being added every year to make it happen. So we know that's going to be higher, right? So global share of electricity by source here, as fossil fuels versus solar and wind, we're expecting that globally, includes China and India, by 2030 we'll be at about par with fossil fuels. Okay, so the change is happening very fast. What does this mean for fossil fuels? Well, the graph here, first thing to note is that this is useful energy. You remember for the diagram before, there's a useful energy that you get and there's a wasted energy. So if you look at the fossil fuel and you made this in proportion to the others, the fossil fuel will be much bigger. But the point here is that the fossil fuel, the use of fossil fuels is going to drop quite substantially over the coming years and coming decades. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that the demand is crashing, but what does that mean for the tar sands, in particular in Alberta? So you may know that the tar sands are among the highest priced energy in the world because it takes a lot of energy to extract the oil from the tar sands, and that makes it more expensive. So the crash for the tar sands is going to happen faster than the overall market. Okay, so you may remember during the pandemic, you see a little dip there in the diagram too. That demand dropped by, I believe it's about 7%, and that was enough to crash the price of oil to the point where it went negative. You had to pay people to take oil. Okay, so a fairly small change in demand will have a significant impact oversized impact on costs. And if you speculate a bit and you imagine that by 2030, it's crashed enough so that the tar sands are actually shutting down because they're uneconomic, That means that at least 20%, I think it's a bit more than 20%, but at least 20% of Canadian GHG emissions, they're from the oil sands production, those would disappear. Okay, so we would get halfway to the federal government's objectives in GHG reductions just by shutting down the tar sands. Okay, so numbers here about the tar sands, just to give you some data to work with. It's a bit old, the data, but it still illustrates the problem. Here they show oil from sand. Total cost is $105 per barrel, production and transport. So if you're selling it for anything, that's a marginal cost. There are some that are less than that. So the smallest number I've heard is $20 per barrel production and in transport. But if oil prices go down to $20-25 a barrel, the oil sands are most or all of them are going to be losing money, and they can't do that indefinitely. So Alberta, we've got a problem. Okay. So other things that I'll try to speed up a bit. So, I've heard that mining will always require lots of fossil fuels. Well, sorry, that's false. So if you follow the mining industry, you'll see that when it comes to underground mining, it's rapidly being electrified for a couple of reasons. It's cheaper, but it's cheaper largely because of ventilation requirements. If you're running diesel equipment in a mine, you have to ventilate it to prevent people inhaling those nasty fumes, right? And people have been telling me, well, we can't electrify all this stuff because trucks like this one, they require diesel to run. Well, in fact, if you look at the technical specs of these trucks, it's an electric motor that's running, actually pushing the truck. It's not the diesel engine. The diesel engine on that truck makes electricity, so it generates electricity, and the actual traction is provided by electric motors. Other examples, the modern cruise ships, they use something called azipods. Those are electric. Okay, so the biggest cruise ships you see today, they use electric motors to push them. Okay, so there's no scale of need that can't be met with electric motors. The picture you see on the right, that's a setup where the overhead catenary is used to supplement what comes from the diesel generator that's on board, and that allows them to, because they use that to go up hills where you use the most energy, it allows them to cut about 60% of diesel use. But that being said, there are some trucks that are already fully electrified, and that trend's going to continue because it's cheaper, right? So let's go to other questions. So processing minerals will always require lots of fossil fuels. That's wrong. Specific examples here, aluminum is processed using electricity. And funny trivial fact is that Canada is one of the biggest producers of aluminum in the world. Why? Because we have cheap energy, cheap electricity in BC and Quebec, and it's hydropowered mostly. So it's clean electricity. So there's very little emissions that are coming from aluminum that's produced in Canada. And actually, some manufacturers are looking to procure more from Canada because it's clean. Okay, steel can be made from hydrogen instead of coke. And every part, I say every part here, there may be some exceptions where it's more difficult, but essentially every part of the supply chain can be electrified. So if you're talking about, it takes a lot of fossil fuels to build a windmill or to build a solar panel. Well, it does currently because we are using lots of fossil fuels for that, but it doesn't mean that has to stay that way. Every part of the supply chain, all the parts of the supply chain, everywhere in the world, people are looking at how can we decarbonize them. Okay, so we're going to see less and less fossil fuels used for that in the future. Another thing I hear is recycling doesn't work. So if we look at overshoot and we look at solutions to overshoot, well, recycling is one thing. So if we don't have to mine new stuff, we could use stuff repeatedly. That's definitely better, right? That gives us a lot more capabilities. So recycling doesn't work when you're talking about plastics. That's absolutely true. And actually, the oil industry, they push this narrative because they wanted to increase production and sales of plastics, knowing full well that only a small minority of plastics are truly recyclable at this point. Okay, this may change, but at this point, only a small portion is recyclable. Now, there are areas where recycling works really well, and I could give you many other examples, but asphalt, okay, surprisingly, asphalt is by weight the most recycled product on the planet. 80% of the asphalt is recycled, and the steel people say that steel might be better, but anyways, whatever. There's still lots of product that's being recycled, and it's much bigger than the much bigger volume than plastics. Lead acid batteries in the U.S., they're recycled at a rate of 99%. We have every reason to think that EV batteries will be at least as high. 80% of the steel in North America comes from recycled steel. Okay. The other benefit here is that recycled steel is recycled using electric arc furnaces, no fossil fuels, right? Waste is expensive. And if you look at from a business point of view, when you look at waste, you want to reduce waste because it's expensive. And if you could do something with the waste to reprocess it, bring it back into some useful product, that's good because you're going to make more money. Okay. So one thing I hear is we don't have enough minerals. Well, okay. So the original batteries that were popular in EVs, so the original Teslas in particular, they use nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistry. And cobalt and nickel are expensive. So what has industry done? Well, they've developed something called LFP, lithium iron phosphate batteries. So iron and phosphate, they're cheap and abundant. Actually, they're cheap because they're abundant. But that leaves lithium that's expensive. So what are we going to do about that? Well, sodium ion. So there are cars actually being sold in China right now that have sodium ion batteries. Sodium is cheap and abundant. Okay. So the limitations on materials that we have, there are technical ways to overcome them. I'm not saying that this is always a silver bullet, but there are ways to overcome them. And people get very creative when they have to do that. And by the way, there is plenty of lithium, but sodium will always be cheaper. And I say always here, I'm quite certain of that. It's the processing that's much easier with sodium, and processing sodium is better for the environment anyways. So we'll see more sodium-based batteries in the future for a bunch of reasons. So the other thing I hear is we don't have enough rare earths, and I'm going to try to speed up a bit more here. So rare earths are mainly used in permanent magnets, and this comes up when we're talking about EVs or windmills in particular, where there are permanent magnets that are used, right? So one of the first thing to note is that existing vehicles have up to dozens of electrical motors, okay, which you mostly use permanent magnets. So this is not an EV specific problem. It's a problem with in general for our consumption society, right? And rare earths are expensive. So what is industry doing? Well, it turns out there's two types of electric motor. You could use permanent magnets, or you could use induction. And induction motors do not require rare earths. Okay, so that's one way to solve the problem of rare earth. The other one is a Tesla and others. There's others that have announced a product. They have developed permanent magnets that don't have rare earths. So in other words, we don't need rare earths for EV motors. Okay, so what is seen as a barrier really isn't in the end. Okay, so expensive things drives people to find alternatives. Now I'll try to speed up a bit more because I'm taking way too much time. But anyways, there's lots of good news that's come out in 2023, and I'll go through some of that. So energy return on investment, on energy invested, that's, you put 1 unit of energy into producing something that gives you energy back, and then how much energy do you get back from that one unit of energy? If you look at the quote at the top, essentially that means that fossil fuels is about 7. So 1 unit of energy to extract, produce, and refine, transport oil and gas gives you 7 units of energy. Okay, that is dropping because as we deplete easily accessible resources, it takes more and more energy to get to the remaining resources. So the number's dropping, but it's increasing for wind and solar. Okay, it's increasing. Why? Because the technology is improving, because the production processes improve, et cetera, et cetera. The payback for solar, and that's the graph you see on the right there. So in payback terms, it takes 2 years to pay back the cost of a solar panel. Okay, that's an average. And you can look at the resources there. There's lots more data. It's quite interesting to dig through if you're interested in that kind of stuff. But we could expect a solar panel to last 30 or more years. Okay, so if we're talking about a payback period of 2 years and it's going to last 30 years, well, your return is about 15. It's twice fossil fuel already, and it's growing. Okay. Wind. So I put the 44 number there because I thought it was quite interesting. But if you look at the reference at the bottom, what the author does is he goes through all sorts of sources of information. The smallest number he found is 16, and the biggest number he found is 44. One of the windmill manufacturers, can't remember, it's the one of the ones from Scandinavia, they claim 40. Okay, so the manufacturer of the windmill claims 40. So we're already at 16, we're already well above fossil fuels. So other good news, so heat pump sales in the US, they've outpaced furnace sales, gas furnace sales in 2022. That's a year and some ago. That's before the RIA in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, came into effect and started driving sales even higher. Okay, China. A lot of people are, talk about China in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. If you remember from the Paris Accord and what was being discussed at that time, China would only commit to peaking emissions in 2030. Okay, so they said that they would not be able to peak emissions before 2030. Well, the deployment of wind and solar has been much faster than expected, so fast that the analysis that's being made right now is that 2023 was probably the peak emission years for China. That's 7 years faster than what was being predicted by China themselves. Okay, so the change is happening very, very fast. We've heard also that we'll never be able to decouple GDP growth from GHG emissions. Well, if you look at the data from Our World in Data, that's not correct. And you see some of the data there for different countries. Canada is not a good example here, as you can see. So the graph on the left is from StatsCan if you want to have a different source of information. But essentially, we are gradually decoupling GDP growth and CO2 emissions. Okay, so and as we decarbonize, we'll get more and more of that. Coal generation dropping. So in the US, and there's an example in North Dakota, where it's so cheap to do solar and wind that they're building new solar and wind to replace existing coal-fired generation capacity. Why? Because it's cheaper to build new solar and wind than to operate an existing plant. Okay, so that's how far the costs have dropped, and you see in the graph at the on the right the impact there on coal consumption for electricity generation. It's dropping. It's been dropping for a while, and it will continue to drop quite a bit. Now, what does all this mean? Well, it means that the IEA projections don't make sense. They really understate the pace of change. If you look at a few examples here, figure 1.3, that's oil demand. They're actually forecasting in this scenario. So this is what they call the stated policy scenario. So this is a scenario that they expect will happen if current policies keep the way they are and they don't change. They're expecting that by 2050, we're still consuming 100 million barrels of oil a day. Well, if that's true, the planet will fry. Okay, that's absolutely unrealistic. And if you look at some of the numbers I was showing earlier, there's no world in where this projection makes sense. Okay, the problem again here is that governments, including the Canadian government, they're using the IEA projections to set policy. So policy is not adapted to what the outcomes are likely to be. Okay. If we look at the IEA, again, they have a net zero roadmap that they published in 2013. It's an update from the 2021 one, but the reason I have it here is that what they're assuming there is that they're essentially painting a scenario where we're able to get to net zero by 2050. Okay. And these graphs are the type of reduction in emissions that we could expect, right? And if you look at figure 2.12, oil would go down from about 100 million barrels a day to somewhere around 20-some million a day, and that would be mostly for plastics and the many other products that we use oil for. Okay, so this looks a bit more like what we could expect with what I believe we could expect with the current policies, not what the policies that they're saying need to be implemented for a net zero emissions scenario. Okay. So what are the risks? Political interference. So you probably know Alberta put a moratorium on green energy, and you have to wonder why Alberta and also Texas, they lead in wind, in particular in North America. Why do they lead in wind? It's because they have electric systems where procurement is done based on cost, and wind is the lowest cost solutions in both places, and that's what's being deployed. So they're using wind and storage to meet the demand, the electrical demand. North Dakota, I already talked about that case before. What's happening there is the utilities want to shut down the plants early, but the unions, governments, and all that are pushing back because of the loss of employment that they're that they're expecting because of that. Okay. Resistance from incumbents. So we talked about disinformation campaigns before, so that's pretty clear. Toyota, what I'll say is Toyota, they're not very liked in the EV world, and Toyota is running. They're running campaigns right now where they say that they have self-charging EVs. Yeah, that's greenwashing, right? That's not a thing, and they are slowing down the move to electric. They've got hardly anything. They have only one Model Electric in North America at the moment, not doing well. We'll park that. But anyways, Toyota is not helping. Global shocks, so warm and climate events and pandemics, as we saw, will affect the pace of change. Now, wars, if you look at Ukraine in particular, there's a short-term increase in greenhouse gas emissions because of the natural gas not going to Europe, but there is a longer-term impact where Europe is deploying green energy much faster than anticipated, so they could reduce their dependence on Russia for natural gas. So bottom line here is the economics will drive the electrification regardless of the risk and regardless of the policies. It's not a question of when, it's a question of when, not a question of if, okay? So if I could summarize what I've said up to now, option 3 is really, to me, it's the only acceptable option. We need to do something. We can't sit around and not do anything. We need to do something, and fast. Technology has evolved. It will continue to evolve. The last 30 years, we've had some capabilities that didn't exist before. If you look at Al Gore's the 2 films he made, Inconvenient Truth and The Truth to Power, you look at the change in tone between those 2 films. The first one, we didn't have solutions that seemed like they would actually work, but by the second film, things had changed considerably, and they've changed even more since then. So I'd encourage you to think about that and see how people like Al Gore and others are seeing paths to decarbonization. Right. So we have paths to deeply decarbonize very rapidly, much faster than what the IEA is projecting, but we need to accelerate that. Okay, we definitely need to accelerate the pace, and we need to do everything we can to remove obstacles and prevent people from slowing down the transition. What I'd like to see is I'd like to see us focus less on the details of what's happening. We know what the problem is. We know climate change is an issue. We know greenhouse gases are an issue. I'm not saying we don't need to do research. We need to do research. We need to understand a lot of stuff, a lot more, that's for sure. But we need to work on solutions, and we need all hands on deck, and we need to act like it's an emergency because it is an emergency. Okay, you may have seen this before, Michael Mann, which I'll show his cover of his book on the next slide. One of the things he's been saying is that back when, a decade or 2 ago, the climate deniers were the issue. But what he's saying is today, the doomers are becoming as much of an issue. So I'd encourage you, if you're in the doomer type, to look at the data and see that there are paths forward that will work, and to help, right? So I've got my own little version of it here. If it's not enough to eliminate all emissions, we're still going to have less pollution, better livable cities and all that, right? So we should do it anyways. So these are the books that some of the books that I've read and consulted for this presentation. One of the quotes from Not the End of the World from Hannah Ritchie is, accepting defeat on climate change is an indefensibly selfish position to take. What she means by that is that us in the rich world, whatever the outcome is, we are going to fare better than most of the poor people out there. Okay, so if we don't do anything about climate change, we're gonna have problems. There's no doubt about that, but we're likely to have much better outcomes than most of the population of the world. So that's why she's saying it's selfish for people in advanced economies to not do anything about climate change. So that's my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Raymond. That was fabulous. And what a really, really good summary and overview of the state of how things are going right now. I think that's really been informative in my opinion. So thank you very much for that. The first questioner we've got online is David Pollock, and on deck is John Meyer, but his video and audio is not working, so I will read for him. So David Pollock, to you.
Are we still sharing screens or where are we?
No, ask your question.
Oh, okay, good. Raymond, thank you very much. It was a real tour de force in terms of the focus on technology and possibilities. I think you're in good company. I've just been reviewing the book Permacrisis that involves three authors. One is a Nobel winner, Michael Spence, and the other Gordon Brown, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. And they also take an optimistic stance where they argue that growth, is not the issue. It's more that you have to make it more sustainable growth and more equitable growth, and that the other problems are governance issues, and they pose solutions, and economic management in terms of the various crises we face. But as I get into their work and as I listen to yours, it felt to me as if you were expressing undue optimism in relation to technological fixes for the multifaceted crises that we face. Now, I realize you were focusing on fossil fuel use and climate change today, but I was posing the question, do you not think that it's possible there's a fourth solution rather than just the three, which would, in a sense, combine some aspects of what you've been talking about in number three, but also some real effort at the notion that Socrates had, that you increase your wealth by retracting your desires, and more focus on cultures of regeneration of nature, and the recognition that we still live on a finite planet, which means in total limited resources, whether it happens to be water or soil for nutrition. So I'm just sounding a note of caution that it felt to me like you would put too many eggs in the basket of technological optimism. And I wonder about other solutions that look at equity and distribution and more focus on the wealthy having less stuff, more land being used for rewilding for other parts of nature's system. So it's just a question of your thoughts on combining options 2 and 3 into a fourth. Any comments? Thanks.
Yeah, there's really a lot to unpack there. And one of the things I had on the last slide is recommending that people look up Hans Rosling. In particular, there's something on YouTube he did that's 200 years in 4 minutes. And Hans Rosling has a way of showing what the progress has been over the last few centuries, and showing that the progress we've made is actually very positive. But to get back to your question, if you look at growth, it's clear growth cannot go on forever, right? We have one planet.
That'd be my
If
view.
you look, right, if you look at population, you look at resource exploitation and all that, there are limits. Limits to growth told us that way back in '72, right? So the issue, I guess, is that the biggest crisis right now is climate crisis, and we don't have very much time to act. So, in terms of changing how advanced society consume and all that, that means changing culture. And if you look at it from the business perspective, culture is the most difficult thing to change in a business, and it's very difficult to change in a society, right? So I don't want to count on culture change to be one of the drivers. So I would discount that. Now, you're absolutely right. There's other things that we face, and population in particular cannot continue to grow forever, and resource utilization cannot continue to grow forever. But if I could give this should probably be another talk. But if you look at beyond climate change and things like population, right now the trend is that the population will peak somewhere around 2050, apparently. Not sure. Shortages of food and all that may make that happen faster. But reality is that if you look at the progress over the years, birth rates are declining and all that. There's countries like China where the population has started to decrease. Japan, Italy, etc. Right? So we need to reduce population ultimately, but the other side of it is how can we prevent or deny people who are poor the standard of living that we have? That's ethically, that's not right, and that's unfair, right? So I think what we're looking at is a situation where we have a number of things that are limits to what we could do on our planet that we need to address. And you're absolutely right that there are some problems that are coming up beyond climate change that we definitely need to work on, right? I hope that answers your question.
Thanks, Raymond.
Thanks, David. Raymond, John Mayer made several comments during your presentation, so I will read a couple of the comments, and then one of them was actually one that could be phrased as a question. So one of the things that John had said was I have to go back and look at it here. The oil sands, the cost of the money, especially for Alberta, and the cost in the oil sands, it actually has major impacts on the Canadian dollar. So as the oil sands crush, so does the Canadian dollar, which makes up over 20% of the Canadian exports. And maybe this will be the end of our Dutch disease for the Canadian dollar. So it might be one way to sort of improve the situation there, or to change the situation radically. One of the other comments he made was, especially with respect for implementation of solar, not so much wind, but solar, it's very much dependent on the latitude at which you're located in the efficiency ratings that you've got for the solar panels. So that those in northern Canada, Europe, and Russia will be considerably less than the same panel in the southern part of the US.
Yeah, so let me address that. So if you look at Europe, the country that's got the most solar, I think it's still true, but it was true certainly a couple of years ago, is Germany. And Germany, if you look at the latitude, much of Germany is higher in latitude than here in Ottawa. Okay, so and if you look at Canada and insulation in Canada, the best place for solar energy in Canada is Alberta.
Yes.
And they're higher in latitude. Why is it better there? It's because they have less cloud cover and all that. So they're able to get more sun for the time of the year where they have sun. So solar solutions are still viable in northern latitudes. Yes, there's issues where you get less production in the winter, and Art would be certainly happy to talk about that. Now, one of the nice things about that, though, is that if you look at wind, we have the opposite phenomenon with wind. It tends to be windier at night when there's no sun shining, and windier in the winter when we have less sun. So the two together are a good complementary set of technologies that help us there. Now, it doesn't solve all the problem. We need some storage of some sort, right? But it's still viable to do solar here. Now, if you look at solar in the Middle East, there's been several projects, very large projects deployed in the Middle East recently that are doing solar, and they're producing solar because they have very little cloud cover and they're much closer to the equator. They're producing solar at less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Okay, so that's very cheap, right? So if you look at those countries and you look at Africa, where people don't have the resources we have here, they will get better outcomes with solar than what we get here. They'll get better efficiency, right? So, so you're right. Absolutely. Higher latitude. There is a problem, particularly in winter, where we don't have that many hours of sun, especially if you go past the Arctic Circle where you get none, but it's still a viable solution. There's actually communities in the north that are off-grid that are using solar as one of the solutions in their set of solutions for electricity.
Good, excellent. The one thing that John had said early on, and this is John's, what I'm going to phrase as a question for him, when it comes to trying to sort out the difference between greenwashing and green truthing, if you will, we need to have metrics, biophysical and ways to measure the full life cycle of the products that we're looking at so that we can differentiate between what is greenwashing and what isn't. Do you know of any of these kinds of metrics that are being used now and if they're available?
I do know some. A couple of things. The actual amount of emissions for a certain product changes over time as things get electrified more and decarbonized, right? So you have to be careful about, reassessing over time. Now, there are some organizations out there that are funded by the fossil fuel industry that are providing that kind of study. So you have to wonder, if it's funded by the fossil fuel industry, should we trust what they're saying, right? So there is one in particular in Montreal that's funded by the fossil fuel industry that's been doing these kind of analysis. So, I'd be careful about who I would trust on that. You need to find a source that's independent of any interest in the markets and the money involved in these technologies.
Okay, thank you. Now I have the next question, and on deck, the next person to ask a question will be Jeff Strong. So my question is pretty simple and straightforward. Recently, we've been hearing about car manufacturers, various ones who've been talking about long life batteries up to 100 kilometers. What are or not 100, 1,000-kilometer range for some of these new EV batteries that they're developing? What are the chances that these things are going to come to fruition in a timely way so that they actually can be implemented?
So there's two aspects to that question. So the first one is I've been driving electric for over 10 years, and I will tell you that unless you're in a really exceptional situation, you're driving from Whitehorse to Vancouver regularly or something like that, at this time, you may need that kind of range, but 400 kilometers is more than enough to travel anywhere else in North America, except for a few exceptions. So we don't need batteries that have as much range as people think that they need. So once you've experienced the electric vehicle lifestyle, if you wish, you see that that's not really necessary. Now, having a 1,000-kilometer range battery that depends on how much battery you want to put in the car. So if you're looking at how technology is progressing, the density of energy per weight is getting better. So for the same weight of battery, you get more range, right? So when you're building a car, there's a trade-off. If you add more batteries for more range, well, that means you use more energy to move the vehicle. So you need to add more batteries to make up for that, right? So there's an issue that when you're putting lots of batteries, you get diminishing returns, right? And if you're someone like me who charges at home, 98% of the time I charge at home or at the cottage if I go to the cottage. The extra range that I have is really wasted. So and that has impacts. So that has impacts on the price of the car, for example. It has impacts on availability of materials to make batteries, and so I think it'd be better, instead of having a 1,000-kilometer battery, it'd be better to make two cars with 500 each, and that would be sufficient for the vast majority of applications here.
A follow-on to that, I've heard, especially with respect to battery life and longevity in Canada, the cold weather or the extreme weathers, whether it be heat or cold, has a major impact on the battery life and the range of the vehicle. Has that improved, or is that true?
Well, so so I have a chemistry background, right? So I understand this stuff quite well. And if you look at chemistry, typically chemical reactions, every time you increase the temperature by 10 degrees Celsius, the reactions typically go twice as fast. Okay, rule of thumb. Which if you look at that and you think about the coldest temperatures, actually the colder you keep your battery, if you're storing it for a long time, the better it is. I mean, the better it is. I mean, there's limits. If you go down below -20, there's some things that happen with certain batteries that are not good. But cold is better than warmth. Okay, so if you look at the Nissan Leafs and the battery problems that have occurred with Nissan Leafs, where degradation happens quite rapidly, that's mostly in warmer climes when people are trying to do long trips in warm weather, where the battery gets very hot and degrades. Okay, in terms of longevity, there's a gentleman out at Dalhousie University, Dr. Jeffrey Dahl, who is one of the researchers is contributing to Tesla battery research. He's got batteries that there was a claim a number of years ago that they had a 1,000,000-mile battery, so a battery that would last for 1,000,000 miles. Back then, when he said that was him saying that he said that because that's where he had been able to test up to now. Right now, what he's saying is he's up to, with the same batteries, 5,000,000 miles or kilometers. I can't remember if it's miles or kilometers, but it's a huge number, right? So if you have a battery that's going to last that long, it's going to more than outlast the life of the car, right? So and that is getting better. So if you're looking at the technologies, I talked a bit about NMC, nickel, manganese, cobalt versus LFP. LFP actually lasts longer. It's a better technology. The density of energy is lower. It's catching up though, but it's lower. But the price is cheaper too. So that combination makes it an attractive solution, right? So batteries are getting better. And we're seeing all sorts of developments. There's lots of money to be made with batteries. Lots of people are doing research to try to get better technologies than the competitor, right? So there's a lot of money being spent on battery R&D at the moment, and that's likely to continue for a while yet.
Great, thank you. Jeff, you're on, and on deck I have John Hollins.
Yeah, Raymond, I kind of jumped the gun embarrassingly with that question because you answered it pretty much right after. But what you might add, add something to it, because every time I've given a presentation in the last 2 years, I get that complaint. Well, what are we going to do with all the dead EV batteries around?
Yeah. So I get that all the time, right? And the reality is they're already being recycled. If you look at a company called Redwood Materials, this was founded by one of the early Tesla executives, they are recycling today the rejects from Tesla. So when you build batteries, you build the cells, not all of them pass the test, right? So the ones that are rejects, they go to Redwood Materials and they are recycling them. Ironically, the problem we're having in a recycling world is there's not enough batteries to recycle, because the batteries are actually lasting longer than we thought they would. So to give you an example, I just traded in my 2013 Tesla Model S. It had 315,000 kilometers on it. Okay, there was a bit of an issue with leakage of water into the battery compartment, but the cells themselves were still very healthy. I still got 85% of the range that I had 10 years ago after 315,000 kilometers, right? So the batteries are lasting long. Once the lifetime is finished in the car, there's actually people that are repurposing them for static storage in particular. So they could have a longer lifetime, but they could also be recycled. So I don't see that as being a problem.
And the technology is improving too. So.
Yes.
My apologies. So on we have John Hollins now, and on deck I have Art Hunter.
Raymond, it's good to hear enthusiasm amongst in a mode where we often hear a lot of very distressing messages. but and they're almost certainly wrong. You might be wrong the other way to some degree. We need to find the happy medium. Look, in the pathways study that we conducted here at KCOR a few years ago, the turnover of stocks of technology was a very important part in the calculations of where things could go. How have you taken account of stock turnover in the forecasts that you've made?
That's a very interesting question. I didn't really look at that. That being said, if you think about what overshoot is, a lot of it is exploiting all the resources that are available to exploit. And if we can take those technologies and at least recycle them, excuse me, so there's movements in different parts of the world, in China, actually in particular in the EU, where they are mandating that devices be recyclable and that kind of thing. So, there's a lot of devices. You look at smartphones, they don't tend to last very long. People change them every 3 years or so, and that's a really short time frame. From my perspective, what's mostly important is what do you do with those things once you're finished with them, and recycling is a huge opportunity there. There's some challenges with recycling, especially the batteries in smartphones, for a bunch of reasons which I won't get into. But we have the will, I think, from some governments to make that easier. And I think we need to get to a point where we have a circular economy where we need as little extra input as possible, that we recycle and reuse as much as possible, right? But again, I didn't really, perhaps naively, with the numbers that I have, I'm leaving that out, and I'm more concerned about the relatively short-term availability of the resources to make these things, right? So, but on a long-term basis, absolutely, we need to recycle all this stuff. We shouldn't be putting anything in a waste pile.
The average lifespan of a regular automobile in Canada is about 12 years, I understand, which means that the cars that were sold last year, 90% of them, will still be here in 2035. And they're still going to be used one way or another, it seems to me. Yep. So Mr. Trudeau's government might want to force the sale of electric vehicle. If we should happen to change prime ministers here, that might not happen. Where do you see Canada going with the politics that we've got right now and what we might reasonably envisage?
So very interesting question. I said a couple of times that economics is driving the change. It's really economics. It's the thing that's driving most of the change. And when you look at EVs, if you look at forecasts of prices of EVs and all that, we are expecting that price parity will be achieved and more in the lower end of the market over the next couple of years. So it's more expensive cars right now, we have price parity. You buy electric or gas, you're paying essentially the same thing. Okay, so and that's one of the big barriers. Now to get back to a couple of these, let's just unpack here. It's been portrayed as the government wanting to force people to buy EVs. That's not what that regulation is about. The regulation is about forcing the manufacturers to make available in Canada the EVs they have, because what's happening right now, and you see this with Toyota again, I use Toyota as an example. In Canada, there are two provinces that have some sales targets, okay, BC and Quebec, okay? Well, if you're a Toyota dealer here in Ottawa, right across the river from Quebec, where Quebec people could come and buy the car, you can't sell the only electric car that Toyota sells in North America. Okay, you cannot get it. They send them all to BC and to Quebec, right? So the regulation is there to get our fair share, if you will, of these cars. So I believe that people are saying that this is being forced upon them. I believe that the problem, it's more like the horse and buggy to car issue and transition. A lot of people resisted that transition for all sorts of reasons. I think when people experience driving electric and have been driving electric for a while, they will see that it's actually a better transportation solution than a conventional vehicle. Okay, so they'll want to adopt it, and I think that economics is going to drive adoption faster than what the government targets are. Okay, so I don't know if that covers every. Oh yeah, the cars. So one thing to note is newer cars tend to be driven more. Okay. I could explain this by saying that if you've got a car that's driving a lot, it won't last very long, right? Because it'll wear out faster. So if you have cars that are on the road, and there are some, and actually I think Dave told us about this a little while ago, that he's got like a 20-year-old car, right? Well, how did it last 20 years old? Part of it is that the car wasn't driven that much, right? So even if we have, say, half of the fleet that's electrified and half that's still gas, the actual driven miles will probably be somewhere around 60% electric versus 40% gas because of this phenomena, right? So yes, there'll be gas cars for some time. There's people with classic cars that they want to keep them for forever, but those numbers are gonna get small pretty fast, and by 2050. There won't be very many gas or diesel cars on the roads, and trucks and buses and all that, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. Art, you are a go, and on deck will be Paul Beckwith. And Art, you've made several comments, and you're free to ask those comments as you go, and Paul will be our last questioner or commenter.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'll skip over my comments. They're there more for the information of anybody looking at the comments later. My real question is with regards to EVs as part of microgrids. As I've made the point in a number of times within some of our Google groups, that I consider a very large EV battery as essential. I don't consider it as a luxury at all. I view it as something that is essential for survival, and in fact to help bridge the gap when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And one wants to have as much storage there as possible. And of course, I take a look at the 7 years that I've been using home batteries, again, Tesla Powerwall batteries. When I put them in, my calculations and estimates said that I should have 3 of them, and I regret now that I didn't put 4 in. And because I'm firmly of the opinion that you cannot have enough, there's no such thing as too many batteries. And if you're planning to survive. Now, I do also want to add in that your comment with Jeff Don out of Dalhousie University. He did say that he had achieved a 5 million mile battery, which is 8 million kilometers, and the degradation was flat. It was not degrading. Therefore, that is going to grow as his testing continues to grow, which says that once you have a battery, you look after it properly, it's going to last you a long time. And anyway, I just added that for clarity.
So
if you're going to address my question.
Sure. So I'll try to touch on it fairly briefly. So bottom line is what you're saying is along the lines of what I was saying earlier about battery life. We have batteries that are more than good enough today, and they're just getting better. right? So, so the battery problem is solved from my perspective. Now, the amount of storage you have is a different story. I'm of the opinion that if things go bad enough, I have to go into long-term survival mode. All bets are off. There's if we're in that bad of a situation, I probably can't feed myself. There's going to be other problems than getting energy, right? Now, that being said, so that talks to the amount of energy you want to have. But if you look at the future of how much electricity we need to go forward, and how can we grow the supply of electricity, and we've talked about this in previous presentation, right? There's something called vehicle to grid, V2G, which I know you are familiar with. That has a lot of potential because the batteries that we have in our cars, even though you'd like to have more storage at home, the battery you have in the car is already quite big. It's the equivalent of about 5 of those power walls you have, right? So the bottom line there is that we have peaks and valleys in demand during the day on the grid, and we could get a lot more out of our existing grid by filling up those dips, charging the batteries at night, essentially, and then taking those batteries, car batteries, and feeding the grid back during peak times. Right? There's a lot of this is a longer discussion, but I think that if we want to be able to grow the supply that we need in a cost-effective manner, one of the best ways of doing that is to leverage those batteries, which you talked about, that that they're essentially going to work forever from all practical perspectives from our frame of mind, right? So running more cycles by using them for V2G is not going to be an issue for those batteries, right? But I see a very big role for V2G in the future.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, and our last commenter or questioner will be Paul Beckwith.
Yes, thank you, Raymond. Very interesting and informative talk. I want to push back a little bit on the statement I think that you made, and many other people make it, is that we all know how bad climate change is. And I would argue that statement itself is greenwashing and is completely, false. Okay, so first, who's we? Well, climate scientists, not even all climate scientists know how bad it's going to be. I mean, people like Michael Mann, I noticed the book, that was one of the books that you've read, a good book, but he still thinks that climate change is not really accelerating. Okay, it's, we tend to think in a linear fashion, but, I think it'll become clear over the next year, so at least it's a short time frame, how quickly climate change is accelerating. We've already passed 1.5 Celsius for this year when the numbers come out, or at least we'll be very close. Probably we'll be passing 2 degrees within 10 to 15 years, 3 to 4 quickly after that. 4.8 is Hansen's number for climate equilibrium for a doubling of CO2 compared to the 3, which is the mainstream science number, the IPCC numbers, etc. So, if you talk about we as being the people in KCOR, many of us know how bad it is. In fact, most of KCOR talks are on climate change. They used to be all different topics, but now most of them are on climate. If you think we is governments, policymakers, etc., the answer is no, they have no idea. They're still talking about keeping under 1.5. The general public, of course, is getting mixed signals, mixed information, but people don't really understand tipping points. They don't understand highly nonlinear abrupt changes in climate. So I just want to say, when you say statements like we all know how bad it is, I argue we have no idea how bad it is. But again, I want to, it's not really a criticism of you. It happens all of the time, people saying this, including my own family members who I, give up trying to change their views. So it's more of a, I don't know. I mean, we have to stay optimistic that we can actually do something and make a difference. But, if you look at the last COP conference that we just had, who's running it, who's in charge, the country it's in, the deals that are made with oil companies. I mean, that agrees with what you're saying, that, you know, we just can't trust the oil companies. We can't trust people in them. Yeah, anyway, great talk. Thank you again. But I caution on that statement. We have no idea.
Yeah, so Paul, I absolutely essentially agree with what you're saying. There's no question there. I may have used the wrong words. What I meant is that we know what the problem is, but we still need, I believe, we still need a lot more research to understand things like, specifically, you talked about tipping points, right?
Yeah.
We need to understand those better, because we need to understand what are the probable outcomes, right? We need to understand it for a bunch of reasons, right?
Yes.
But
I just want to, yeah, I forgot to mention if you're not familiar with the report called Global Tipping Points, it was put out during the COP conference, I believe, by the University of Exeter. And it's a 450-page, roughly, document report. And it doesn't just talk about Earth system tipping points, the bad things. It talks about tipping points in electric cars, in batteries, in all of these aspects that you were talking about in your talk. So I highly recommend that people, you know, just Google global tipping points, Exeter University, you know, download the 450-odd page report, and it's chock full of great work on these very aspects.
yeah, it's very interesting you bring that up. I did not read that, and actually I will go and read it. That sounds super fascinating. On the business side of things, forget about the natural science side of things. There was this big thing, about a decade ago, where tipping points were the talk of the town, right? Because from a business perspective, what you want to do is you want to have enough market share that then you could build on the market share type of thing. So that's a tipping point too, right?
Yeah.
So there are many situations where tipping points exist, but I'm particularly concerned, and there was a thread on that yesterday, I believe, where I'm particularly concerned that there could be tipping points that are a real problem for us. So I absolutely
right. So the whole point is, we need to have social, human-based tipping points on the way we do things in our society in order to counteract, any of these Earth system tipping points, which can skyrocket temperatures.
And one of the things that was discussed over the last couple of days is methane, potential of methane bombs, right, with permafrost and all that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Those could make a huge difference. So we really need to understand that stuff, right? So I agree with you. We need to do a lot more research. We know a lot of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff we don't know. Yeah. And knowing more is always a benefit, particularly in this context. I think it's absolutely essential for us to continue doing that. My point was, we need to also do something about it, right? If we're only talking about the problem and not actually getting to a solution, we're not improving the situation. We're just getting more information about how bad things are. That's the context that I was meaning, right?
Yep. Right. Okay.
Thank you thank you, Paul. Thank you, Raymond, for that. Before I pass it over to Ted Manning to give the final thank you, I'd like to recommend that everybody take a look at the chat. There were many more comments that were made that were not able to be addressed in terms of a question, and a few other things that are in there. So please look at the chat when you get an opportunity to do so. Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Ted now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Raymond. This was wonderful. It was very nice to begin the year on a very positive note. If there are solutions, you just sold me an electric car. I think I've got a 12-year-old beast, so I'll be talking to you later. But yes, those questions certainly came up in my mind as well. Tipping points are very important, and I was very delighted that in the end, Paul and others brought up the notion of social and ecological and physical ones, because quite frankly, the Meadows and Jorgen Randers, when they did the 30th year up date to limits to growth made it very clear that they had to be considering not just the biological and physical, but also the human and the sociological. And I was delighted that you addressed the issues that really people are choosing, and people are in fact trying to force them to choose sometimes in the wrong way. When I watch things like the current Premier of Alberta or our current opposition leader, I can see them forcing us back to having somebody walk in front of electric cars holding a red flag just to warn people away. It reminded me of the transition we talked about of going from horse to horseless carriages. So Raymond, it's wonderful that you came to talk to us about this. In fact, I think we want to schedule you again for next year because it's moving so fast. We need the good news again. So I would thank you again. And I'll now do the commercial for us, which is the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome is happy to bring you this weekly. We will hit our 200th one this summer, where we're going to have a bit of a celebration. We will have a special speaker for the time. We're not prepared to release them yet because we have not convinced them to talk to us, but that will be coming. Every week we have something interesting and sometimes very stimulating. And as people have said, we focused a lot on climate change lately. We're also trying to, again, bring it around to a range of different issues that are of importance. One of the reasons for this is the Canadian Association is about to redo its strategy. And we want to get a range of inputs into it regarding what issues people think are most important. And those of you who went online today, there's a notice there on the strategy we are developing, and we are soliciting ideas and inputs, and it'll be a little more formal later in the month when we get a little more organized in terms of how we're going to do this and how we're going to ask you guys the questions. So that said, we would like you to continue to join us, continue to share your ideas, to belong. For those of you who are not members, there always is that opportunity. Just see our website at canadiancore.com. And please, for those of you who are not members, please at least subscribe, because it makes it easier for us when it goes on YouTube. So thank you all very much. Have a great week. And we'll turn this over now. We'll now stop recording so we can share ideas and whatever we wish for the next half hour or so. Have a great week.